Hello and welcome to today's episode of Illuminating Veterinary Care. I'm your host, Kieran Fletcher, and today I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Josh.
Thanks for having me again, Kieran.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thank you for joining me. And today in this episode, Josh and I are going to be focusing on the topic of lockdown dogs. What we mean by this is basically we're going to have a chat about the exploration of how the COVID-19 lockdowns have affected dog behaviour, including under-socialisation, separation anxiety and reactivity, as well as how owners and professionals are navigating the consequences. And we're going to look at this in a few different ways. So the making of lockdown dogs, the rise of separation anxiety, other emerging behavioural challenges that have come about over the last few years, the behavioural industry's response, and also guidance for dog owners. So, Josh and I are, of course, not veterinary professionals ourselves, but we are both dog owners. We do both have cockapoos. I myself have Obi, who's about 18 months old now, so he's thankfully not a lockdown dog himself. And Josh, you've got your own as well, haven't you?
I do, yeah. I've got another cockapoo called Mila, and she's roughly the same age as Obi, so also not
Roughly.
a lockdown
Good
dog.
little dog joke there. So, I think to start off, as I've mentioned, so we want to look at the topic of lockdown dogs. It's no secret that there was, of course, a surge in the number of dogs that families in the UK bought during the lockdown. So when Josh and I are using the phrase lockdown dog, we basically mean a dog that was, excuse me, perhaps bought during that time or adopted during that time at a young age, a dog that basically, I suppose you could say, started its life during the lockdown period, the main kind of 2020 into 2021 sort of lockdowns. So I think that to start off with, Josh, I know, again, just so our audience is aware, neither of us had dogs in that time, but we've both had dogs since. And with regards to kind of how things started off, there was a lack of socialization. You know, there's all these different factors to keep in mind, an underexposure to what might be considered the normal. And this is a topic that we've both had vets talk to us about in terms of how they're still seeing dogs with behavioural problems that were bought during the pandemic and were affected by the changes that the pandemic brought about. So have you got anything you want to just kind of start off with, Josh, about kind of the making of lockdown dogs, as it were?
Yeah. I think that if we stayed in lockdown for the whole of the dog's life, then you probably wouldn't notice it as much. I think that for dogs, their environment is everything. It's rules in the house dictate rules outside of the house. And for my dog especially, and other people's cockapoos and badly bred dogs, I think that it's hard to expect a dog that's been cooped up for a year or more to then adapt very quickly and start behaving, I say in inverted commas, normally, or to what we'd expect from any other dog once they've been cooped up. So I think having lots of dogs that are kept inside during COVID, you're obviously going to have an influx of badly behaved dogs because they're not used to the outside world. They're not used to the smells. They're not used to the sights, the sounds. I've spoken to a number of vets who have said they've approached patients who are actually scared of cars. And this was at the very sort of end of the lockdown when they started to see people a lot more often. And you started having these lockdown dogs coming in for jabs. And they're actually scared of cars on the road and will cower away in sort of in corners when cars are driving past. So I think it's sort of little things like that. And I think having a lockdown is a recipe for any animal, not just dogs, and even people sometimes to react a little bit differently to a newer environment for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's, I've got a quote here from Dr. Rowena Packer, who's author of an RVC study that was done just after the pandemic with regards to dogs. And she'd emphasised that introducing puppies to people, other dogs, and the world around them was potentially very important for long-term and emotional well-being. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that dogs that were puppies that were raised and trained before the pandemic are all perfect. I appreciate it comes down to the individual breed. It comes down to the effort that's gone to by the owners and such. But I have to say, doing the research that we've done for this podcast, I completely agree with what Dr. Pack is saying. The element of, for me, with my puppy Obi, introducing him to friends, family from an early stage has been really important. He's now very sociable. He's happy to see people. But you can appreciate that when dogs are not seeing people and the only interaction they're having with human beings is, if the postman's coming to the door and hurriedly leaving, or if you're having a delivery and they have to leave it and go away, so they're hearing the doorbell, there's no one there, or if you're shouting somebody through the window, they're not seeing how humans socialize. And when there is this kind of sense of nobody's coming in, it's almost as if, this is our space, we must defend it, we must look after it, we must look after the pack that's inside this this den, this home, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And that's affected things massively as well. I've actually got a note on that somewhere that I'll try and find, but that's something we need to keep in mind. It's almost like we were demonstrating defensive behaviours by not going out, not letting people in. If we did go out, it was just for a walk. We didn't go anywhere socially. We didn't go and deliberately meet with people or other dogs, things like that.
Yeah.
Kids stopped having friends over for dinner or tea, depending on what part of the world you're in.
Didn't go for coffee dates.
No.
You see that a lot now. You see that a lot. I know that Costa Coffee have now introduced dogs to be allowed in all of their cafes. I'm not sure if you're aware of that,
Okay.
Kieran.
I was not. No.
But I've been seeing on forums of social media that people are having dog meetups at Costas. And so you go out for a big dog walk, and then you have a dog meetup at a Costa. But that stuff didn't happen during lockdown. So, like you said, rightly so. The dog's home is their only environment. It's the only environment that they're used to. They're used to the garden. They're used to sitting on the sofa, and they're used to their own space. So then taking a dog out of that space and expecting them to react like it is a second home, like it would be for many dogs that outside of lockdown, many puppies outside of lockdown who are used to that, then you're asking for a dog to react differently than you would want it to. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that our audience certainly would have a good idea as to the idea of lockdown dog. I think after what we've just discussed. So, if we move on to the next kind of section we want to talk about, which is the rise of separation anxiety. Now, again, I've read another study which is according to the Kennel Club, and this was regarding new puppy owners. And it says that 52% of new puppy owners thought about how they might look after their puppy after lockdown. So 48% of people who bought a puppy or adopted a puppy during lockdown didn't give any thought to what we're going to do when we go back to work. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate that as new puppy owners, you're not immediately going to be an expert. You're not immediately going to know how to handle everything that comes about. But still, I think, almost half not thinking about what might happen when they do go back to work is quite a staggering statistic, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people really think about how it's going to impact the dog, to be honest.
Yes, absolutely.
I think people think that unlike a cat that's quite independent and likes its own space, dogs are naturally pack animals.
Yes.
So if you're around, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with leaving your dog alone, but if you're around that dog for any extended period of time, like my partner is on mat leave at the moment, so she's at home for the next sort of year or so, it's going to be a real struggle trying to get a dog back into a routine where there's not going to be somebody around all day again, and it'll be like starting again. So I don't think people really think about the impact that it's going to have on that dog's behavior, that dog's mood, because it's gonna, once you go back to work or whatever, that dog's going to be like, "What's going on?" They're not going to know that lockdown restrictions have been lifted. They're not going to know why you're leaving the house. They're not going to know why you're leaving without them. And they're going to be in that space, and it, I think, inhibits quite a lot of bad behaviors that have been happening. So bad behaviors such as, the destructive chewing, which I've experienced firsthand when I got my puppy. So we moved into a little anecdote here. We moved into our new house when we got our puppy when she was about 3 months old. Left her for about 20 minutes and she chewed up 2 carpets in my house. So it's stuff like that destructive behavior, that barking, but then not having anybody there to tell them not to do that as well. And then you're coming home and you're upset and frustrated with the dog for those behaviors, but it's not right to tell them not to do that because they won't understand what's going on.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, I mean, my wife and I with Obi, we wanted to get a dog because we didn't like the idea of leaving them at home on their own for long periods of time if we're both out of the office. And my wife, thankfully, has a job where she works from home full time, and I work from home 2 days a week. So we wanted to do it because it meant that Obi would never be on his own. For the grand scheme of things. Now, if we absolutely have to leave him, we can, but we set up a camera and we can see he's not best pleased about it. He doesn't have any destructive behaviours or anything, thankfully, which I think is just sheer luck. We've not taught him anything in that respect, but we're fortunate because he doesn't chew anything. He's just upset. He's clearly not happy when you look at him on the camera.
Yeah.
But I think, as I say, with Obi, he's known no different. And thankfully, we're in a position where even though lockdown restrictions are lifted and such, my wife still works from home full time. But for those people that, the whole family or whether it's, parents had to go back to work full time and children had to stay at home, naturally, those dogs are going to be freaking out, for want of a better expression. They'll think, well, hang on a minute, I've got used to having company all day. Where the heck is everybody going? So you can appreciate why there may well be some behaviours that come about from that. So, and according to the Kennel Club as well, as of now, we have the highest numbers of reported cases of separation anxiety in dogs in the UK ever. So that says it all, really, doesn't it? That's it. And I appreciate that, of course, it's been since the pandemic, but I think during the pandemic, of course, caused the beginning of it, and now there's even more of it because, again, there's people working from home more regularly because of what the pandemic brought about. But yeah, highest reported cases ever.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I can report it. I'll be part of that statistic. My dog is definitely has separation anxiety. I mean, it's different on our end because it wasn't a lockdown issue. We struggled to sort of understand where it comes from, but I think we naturally have tried to sort of battle that and try to figure out, why is that happening? Because we can leave our dog at home on their own for an extended period of time. I'm not talking about a full working day, but for 3 or 4 hours, my dog would be absolutely fine. But she somehow brings that separation behavior and those bad behaviors when we're there at the same time. So those behaviors of her barking and howling when we leave has then moved into the home when we're at home as well. She's become very, very territorial, and we wonder what causes that. For us, I spoke to a number of vets about it, which is it's a great thing. I'm in this industry, so I spoke to a number of vets, and actually, I do want to emphasize me and Kieran are not professionals. We're not fit to give any advice on medication or anything like that. But
merely dog owners.
Merely dog owners trying to sort of get through what works and find out what works. But for us, something that did work is actually having an adaptil collar, and that basically releases pheromones, happy pheromones, you could say, into the dog's air so that they feel more comfortable in the home. and then they feel more comfortable outside of the home as well, because it's teaching them that the world is not a scary place. I think that a lot of vets and vets that I've spoken to have said there's been a massive rise in, yes, the cases of separation anxiety, but also vets prescribing doggy antidepressants. I believe one of them is called fluoxetine, and there's been a massive rise in that, and a massive rise in dog behaviorists recommending that as well. So I think, shocking that there's been a massive surge in dogs with anxiety and lockdown dogs. And I think, lockdown is definitely the cause of it, but naturally we're trying to look for ways to battle that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in terms of when I come back to what I mentioned about how we demonstrate these defensive behaviours, or at least did during lockdown, especially if a dog has then got used to that but sees us going out, it feels as though it can't protect us. Because I think I appreciate it. This isn't necessarily going to be the case with everybody's dog, but Obi is much more protective of my wife than he is me. So he's more likely to bark at other dogs when he's out on a walk with just my wife than he is with me. Which could just be an Obi thing. It could just be sheer coincidence, but it could be related to that sense of protection and defending and such. Which, going back to what you originally touched on, Josh, they are pack animals. So being isolated and left on their own, even if they're well trained with it, they can cope with it. But dogs naturally won't like it, which I think is just part of their nature. That's part of their DNA. They're never going to like being left alone. Even though I appreciate some dogs are less sociable than others. Huskies come to mind. I've spoken to some vets who've emphasised that Huskies are very independent. Whilst they are pack animals, originally, as a pet, they are quite independent. They're not necessarily the most cuddly pets. They like to just have their feed, have their walk, and then they don't really want anything to do with humans in some cases. But in terms of what we've mentioned there about that kind of rise of separation anxiety, I think for some dogs as well, it can be that element of then they're still not used to socializing in terms of, if anybody comes around to the house or if anybody comes to the door or anything like that, they don't like that side of things. And then being shut off in a room or sometimes in the whole house, and they don't know what's going on, they don't know where people have gone. And like I say, when it comes down to the statistics, 3.2 million new dog homes were created in the UK during the pandemic.
Wow.
3.2 million. So if you think about that's 3.2 million dogs getting used to being with their owner or their families constantly, and then they go back to work or back to school, whatever it might be, that is naturally going to stress them out. And, unfortunately, we are seeing the effects of that now, still to this day. And there's been a lot of research to suggest that things have got worse over that time. So, of course, it's affected them when they're puppies, when they're at home. But then as they've got older, those behavioural changes have come to the fore more as they've grown. So maybe they have become more aggressive. Maybe they have been more anxious. They've got worse as the dogs got older because they're then at a point where it's not as easy to teach them otherwise.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Just going back to the statistic, though, I guess what you also need to think about is the massive impact that is having on vets and nurses,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and practices as a whole. You've got. I've spoken to nurses and vet nurses, who have said now all of these animals are coming in for their yearly vaccinations, yearly jabs and checkups yearly. It's massively increasing the workload that they've got. They're also having to deal with many more cases of having to be adaptable with these anxious dogs,
Mm.
and it's creating a massive burden on one workload, and also on stress. The stress
Yes.
that it causes vets, and the stress that it causes veterinary professionals. Yeah, I mean, 3.2 million is obscene.
Hmm.
That is obscene, and if you try and you're adding on a few, what, 100 more patients to a practice in any particular area, and it's going to
At least.
at least it's going to massively impact vets' mental well-being with the increased workload. You're going to have increased issues. Things are going to be busier, and then ultimately linking to our previous podcast, you're going to have more cases of burnout.
Hmm.
For
Which
sure.
you can listen to
Yeah.
that previous episode. It is available to listen to. So, I think that would probably be a good point to move on to the next section, which is the other emerging behavioural challenges, which you and I have discussed. I mean, our respective cockapoos have their behavioural challenges and quirks, let's call them, because we've come to love them, of course, as their owners. And thankfully, I can say that Obi has nothing aggressive or anything like that, but it's more things that could have been trained out of him at an early stage. For instance, I spoke to you earlier about the jumping. So whenever he sees people, he likes to jump up at them. Now, this is something that I really wanted to ingrain getting out of him, but unless everybody does it, they won't learn that it should be all four on the floor, as in their paws. Don't jump up at people. But I won't name names, but there were certain people in the family who loved him jumping up, loved giving him attention, and so he now knows no different. So
Yeah.
that was a battle. Unfortunately, I did not win. But as we've discussed, there are other behavioural challenges that come with things. Now, something that I'd like to emphasise here is that the BBC did some research a couple of years ago now, and so-called pandemic puppies, as they've been referred to, a great many of them were actually imported from outside the UK. And basically, they'd not been bred or reared in appropriate ways. So that in itself leads to biological issues and other traits, shall we say, that can lead to these behavioural problems occurring. And naturally, growing up in lockdown meant they weren't socialised properly, as you would want a dog to be. So that has led to these behavioural challenges, and these can be many things. I mean, it can be pulling on the lead, it can be aggression towards other dogs, it can be aggression towards children. I've known a few dogs be quite aggressive towards children. Not that I've had myself, just in terms of what you hear.
Yeah. I have.
Yes, I didn't
Yeah.
know if you'd want to bring that up, but
Yeah. Well, you see, it was concerning for me. I think that there's a big issue in my home, or there used to be, with hierarchy, and with dogs naturally being pack animals, they're going to have a hierarchy. You can't avoid it. There's going to be a member of the household that's at the top. In my case, it's me. I'm at the top. I don't get disobeyed, not very often anyway. And then my dog, Mila, saw that it was me, and then she was in the middle, and then my partner right at the bottom. So what happened really, is we had a nephew that came to the house. He's 3 years old. Came to the house and invaded her space. Now, at the time, my partner wasn't fantastic at sort of telling the dog not to sort of stay on the sofa. Much better at it now, but wasn't fantastic at it. And nephew went and sat on her spot on the sofa. Now that incited a lot of aggression. Baring of the teeth. Quite a show, really. But with me, if I was there, that wouldn't have happened. So I think, linking to what you said about jumping up and all four on the floor.
Mhm.
I've not heard that used before, but makes sense. But y- you know, the whole household and visiting regular visitors have to be on the same level. in order for
Yes.
this dog to learn. Because otherwise, what you're going to have in my case is when I'm around, the dog is perfectly well behaved.
Hmm.
When I'm not around, Mila is very badly behaved, or she was at least. Very, very badly behaved, inhibits these aggressive behaviors, is really, really loud with barking, really bad with the postman, like you said, visitors, doesn't like people being in a general space. But I think for her, because I'm above her, I am her protector, if you'd like, and those behaviors are not exhibited.
Mm. It's the respect thing, isn't it? I think
Yeah,
she respects you as the leader of the pack.
she does. Yeah, she does indeed. She does indeed. So I think your anecdote of the Obi causing or being or disobeying your rules is much to the fault of no offense to your extended family members, but much to the fault of them
Yeah, yeah, I
because
completely agree, as I have told them.
yeah.
So, I mean, just going back to my point I made earlier about the 3.2 million new dog homes created. Of course, not everybody who got a dog could afford a really well bred, well raised dog. During that time period, especially when people didn't know what was happening with money and things like that. And sadly, this created a gap in the market for backyard puppy farms and farmers. And in that rush to kind of produce more puppies, less care naturally was taken in choosing potential parents. There may well have been cases of inbreeding and things like that. And before you know it, you've got a generation of anxious puppies and puppies that will have behavioral problems because they haven't, it sounds awful saying it, but haven't been bred properly. The due care and attention hasn't been taken because people saw an opportunity to make a quick buck.
Yeah.
Which is incredibly sad, but it's that sense of, we now have to do what we can with these dogs. Now, I think something else that doesn't help with the behavioral side of things is that I know a lot of people like to go to puppy classes and take their young puppies to trainers, behaviorists, whatever it might be. Now, what we have to remember is that some of these people, trainers and behaviorists, were furloughed. And during the pandemic, you couldn't have big groups. So even if they wanted to do an outdoor training session, you couldn't really do that. You couldn't have had any one-on-one training or anything like that, again, because of the rules around social distancing and such. So I know that some people then related to doing things online, which is great to a degree, but at the same time, dogs learn from seeing what the dogs around them are doing. They learn from being able to socialize and things like that. So then you also get these unqualified people doing videos on YouTube and wherever else, trying to make a quick buck. And I think that most vital element of puppy development, which is the socialization, was lacking. So no matter what happened with these online training, or whether it's an unqualified so and so on YouTube, there just wasn't that socialization factor, which was such an important thing. And that also added to the behavioral problems, which again can be things like pulling on the lead. In fact, I've got a statistic somewhere if I can just find it. Okay, so out of more than 1,000, and this is related to the RVC survey that I referenced earlier. So out of more than 1,000 UK dog owners who bought a dog during the pandemic, 97% reported their dog had at least one behavioural problem from a list of 24 that was provided. While on average, owners reported 5 problems at least. So when you think about, I mean, it's tough enough when a dog can have one behavioural problem, and then for these dogs during the pandemic to have 5. And the most common problem was pulling on the lead, reported by about 2/3 of participants, jumping up being second, and poor recall being third. So again, I think it just shows there that when these dogs aren't socialising and they are being raised without lessons or any sort of training, naturally behavioural problems will flourish because they're not in a position where they can really be educated properly. In my again, just to re-emphasize, disclaimer: Josh and I are not behaviorists. We are not veterinary professionals. We are merely working with vets, and having some wonderful conversations with amazing people in the sector. And again, as dog owners, we wanted to talk about a topic that has been raised by vets that we deal with, and something that we've also kind of witnessed ourselves with our own eyes. So, I mean, those behavioural issues that I've mentioned there, Josh. What are your thoughts on those and some of those statistics?
97%. Is that real? 97%. Wow. I mean,
97%,
that.
at least one of 24 behavioural problems.
Yeah, that is, I mean, obscene. I understand pulling on the lead. I think a lot. I, th- I can't say that pulling on the lead is, for me, a behavioural issue. I
Mm-hmm.
think that yes, it's annoying and nobody enjoys it, and you don't enjoy having your arm ripped out of its socket when you see another dog. My dog does it. I'm sure Obi probably does it.
No.
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 Well, look,
Obi
very
doesn't.
lucky.
He's got a harness where we clip him at the front, so every time he
Right.
tries to pull, he flips around, and it works a treat.
I might have to ask for the Amazon link to that. That sounds fantastic.
Other
But
retailers are available.
I don't see that massively as a lockdown issue. I think a lot of dogs do that. A lot of young dogs do that.
Yeah.
It's an excitement thing. It is an excitement thing. The poor recall um, might be a lockdown issue. It could be that the dog is seeing the world for the first time properly, wants to sniff, wants to smell everything, and says, see you later. I'm going to go for a run and chase a squirrel.
Well, I think, sorry to interject, but I think the 2 points you've mentioned there, I can see how they are linked to being a lockdown issue. Because, for instance, the pulling on the lead is something that sometimes puppies are taught at a training school. And some people, if they are, especially if they're a first-time dog owner, they've maybe not had one before, they might not know how to train them to not pull on the lead. And then the bad recall during the pandemic, I would imagine that a lot of people didn't want to risk their dog being off the lead, because if they went off, ran up to someone or another dog, at some points we didn't know if animals themselves might carry COVID. And, they don't want their dog to run off and be fussed by someone who has COVID. Or on the flip side, if a dog then got itself hurt, needed veterinary attention, that's then having to socialize in a veterinary practice or an hospital or something like that, and that's interaction with people. So I can understand why some of these factors might be referred back to lockdown. I can appreciate maybe it's pulling at strings a little bit, but I'm just trying to empathize with those poor people who did have such a hard time with it during the pandemic.
Yeah. I think those issues have always been a thing. I think that, like you said, lockdown hasn't helped.
Yes, I think you're right.
It's made things worse. Pulling on the lead. If you're not taking your dog out as regularly during lockdown and you're not lead training them properly, and like you said, if you're a first-time dog owner, you get a puppy because you're lonely, and you don't really do any research into it. You get a badly bred puppy from a backyard breeder, and haven't really thought about how you actually train a dog. Then yes, lead pulling is going to be an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Or recall is going to be an issue, and I think these behaviours have definitely been made worse. I don't think the behaviours have never existed before.
No, you're right.
I think I've had dogs all of my life. A lot of them have had bad recall, and have pulled on the lead. Whether that's an issue with bad training on my family's part, or an issue with socialization or something similar. I don't think it's come from lockdown, but yeah, I think the issues probably have been made worse. And 97% of reported incidents reporting over 5 issues. Did you say? Definitely doesn't sound fantastic. It's obviously
No.
due to the rise in the amount of dogs, the rise in new owners, because I would imagine the vast majority of these new puppies are from owners that don't have another dog in the house.
Yes.
This puppy cannot copy this older dog's behaviour, and don't, if you don't mind me saying, probably don't know what they're doing to
No, I agree. I completely agree. And I think, I mean, for instance, for me, when when my wife and I got Obi as a young puppy, I'd watched a number of YouTube videos about various different training because I was determined to do the training myself. I didn't want to have to take him to a puppy school and things like that. Um, and thankfully, for the most part, they worked. But you have to just be careful about who you're watching, because some people out there are fully qualified, highly experienced dog training professionals. And there were two that stood out for me, that I won't name in case of copyright or anything like that. Don't want any sort of infringements. But there were two that, they'd got a legitimate website. They were clearly highly experienced in what they were doing, and they had so many useful videos for people who got a new puppy. And some of the videos at that time were 4 or 5 years old, so they will have been around during the pandemic. But not everybody thinks to do that, and some people will have just tried things on their own. Some might have worked, some definitely won't have worked. But it seems as though, from just coming back to the survey, that overall control problems were the most common type of trouble, which 84% of participants reported, and 25% reported that having raised their dog during lockdown led to aggressive behaviours. Now, of course, this links into the real reason that we're doing this in terms of the veterinary professionals that we work with and talk to. If there's an extra 25% of aggressive dogs, so if there's 250 aggressive dogs for every 1,000, that's a lot of risk for vets. Whether it's, and even if some of these dogs are muzzled, sometimes they can be so strong that they can still cause a lot of damage. And I spoke to a vet only last week, in fact, and she was having 6 months off to recover from an horrendous bite that she'd received. She didn't say what type of dog it was, but it's a risky job. I don't think people realize. I think sometimes people think, oh, it must be lovely being a vet, just making animals well again. Like you see in these children's cartoons and things like that. It must be wonderful, but there is a hell of a lot more to it, and it is something where, on occasion, I don't wish to make it sound like I'm making too fine a point of it, but you are putting your body on the line.
For
Especially
sure.
when you're dealing with dogs. And again, if there's an increase, I mean, a quarter presenting aggressive behaviours, that is concern, not only for vets, but also other dogs in the surrounding area, in the same community, owners, children. And especially, again, if these aggressive dogs aren't well trained on the lead, do jump up at people, it's it's kind of hard for everybody involved, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's funny you said you spoke to a vet last week. I spoke to a different vet last week who was dealing with a very anxious lockdown dog, and she actually used the phrase "lockdown dog." It was a Labradoodle. So, I mean, if nobody knows what a Labradoodle looks like, you'll have to look it up. But they're big, big cockapoo type dogs. Look like cockapoos, but they're the size of Labradors or even bigger.
Yes, like a cockapoo on steroids.
Yes, exactly. And she was dealing with a very anxious one who didn't like the table in the office, in the consult room, and tried to jump off the table. But obviously, I mean, it's quite a drop. If you're a regular visitor to the vet practices, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Quite a drop off the table. So she actually tried to catch the dog. And you can imagine a 30+ kilo dog, and you're trying to hold. I think she said she was holding a vaccine in one hand, and you've only got one hand free. You're trying to catch 30 kilo in one arm, and it shattered her shoulder.
Oh,
And she
gosh.
says she's got surgery on I think it was Monday this week, and then a long 12 weeks of physio and recovery. So I think there is that element of increased risk, like you said. 25%, 250 out of 1,000. You're massively increasing the risk to vets. Yeah, massively.
Absolutely. And again, it's a frightening statistic. So the penultimate section we want to talk about, and I think this is one that might be a bit more brief, is that the behavioural industry's response to lockdown dogs, and dealing with behavioural issues. So the thing that I've come across, as mentioned earlier, I've done my research on this, and I've been referencing notes, especially people who are watching the video will be able to see. But um, the done thing seems to be that if you are concerned your dog has any sort of behavioural issue, go to the vet first, because they can rule out if it's anything health related. Because behavioural changes can come into play due to health changes or issues that a dog may be facing. So I would urge any listeners to the podcast, or any viewers, if you are concerned about a sudden change, take your dog to the vet first. That seems to be the best port of call.
And just to add on to that, when I took my dog to the vet, I think a lot of people forget that if your dog has bad behaviors, aggressive behaviors, you have to remember you are responsible for that dog.
Yes.
So if that dog goes out and hurts another dog, or hurts a child, or even an adult, you are responsible for that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have not tried to prevent that in any way by taking the dog to the vet and then being referred to a behaviourist, you're still responsible.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is what it comes back to again in that statistic I read out earlier, that 48% of people who bought dogs during lockdown, who did the study, of course, not absolutely everybody, but 48% did not think about how the dog would be affected when they go back to work, which I just think is it's like the old adage, a dog is not just for Christmas. And I think people need to realize, if you're getting a dog, it's, sometimes a 10, 15, maybe even longer year commitment to another life. And, some people, I've got friends who literally see their dogs as their children. Unfortunately, the lady of the couple is not able to have children, and she absolutely loves dogs. And so she's just said, right, my dogs are my babies, effectively, which I know for a fact she's not alone in. And it's that sense of, we are responsible for them as owners, as you are for Mila and I am for Obi. And we must take responsibility if they misbehave, and of course we can celebrate if they do something that's wonderful, and take all the acclaim and the credit for it. But again, behaviorists, as I mentioned earlier, of course, some of them were furloughed, some of them weren't able to work during the pandemic. But now that we are, well past lockdown, 5 years on, effectively, I think the problem behaviors need addressing sooner. I think if people see them, the sooner you deal with them, the better. Because if you leave them or don't train them properly, or train them out of doing those behaviors properly, it can certainly lead to more issues further down the line. And another instance of this RVC survey, which is absolutely insightful, I must add. 96% of owners praised their pets verbally when training them themselves. Okay, so bear in mind, this is people who've trained them themselves. They couldn't use a trainer or a behaviorist. But 80% also reported using one or more aversive methods or aids, and 39% admitted they used two or more. So I know that some of these can be things like shock collars, which are just absolutely inhumane. Some people hit their dogs with leads or other things like that. And I don't wish to dampen the mood of anybody listening, but unfortunately that is the truth of it. That is what some people do. So again, they long term will likely lead to some serious issues that a behaviorist, it could almost be too little too late taken into a behaviorist after too long a period of bad training. So it's important to see a behaviorist as soon as possible if you do think that there are those issues.
Yeah, the right behaviourist, though. I mean,
Absolutely, yes.
in terms of the industry's response, you mentioned there's a lot of self-proclaimed behaviourists that have come along since lockdown. A lot of YouTube videos and online gurus that claim that your dog has a 10-minute fix required. I think asking, and this also links back to going to your vet in the first instance, because your vet will have a list of approved behaviorists that you can go to. And more
Yes.
often than not, these approved behaviourists will have a qualification in animal behaviour. And you'll also be able to go down the insurance route, because I know that when I did it, we had a little sort of shop around, and for the vast majority of these behaviourists, we couldn't go down the insurance route because they weren't qualified. And so we asked the vet, and the vet gave us a list of them, and we could then go down the insurance route because they were qualified in animal behaviour, and they were the right people to approach. And they all of these behaviourists that were qualified had, more often than not, the same opinions.
Yes.
Whereas the ones that weren't qualified had completely separate opinions. So it's important to go to the right place.
Yes.
And linking back, go to your vet first, get an approved list of behaviourists. And if necessary, you can combat the behaviour with the behaviourist, and also, if really necessary, with a medication as well, because that was the option we had to go down for Mila. It was working with a behaviourist, but also having some medication as well, and doing that as a package.
Okay. So I think that links nicely onto our next point, actually. So guidance for dog owners. So I think what you've touched on there, Josh, is really good. So kind of linking back to what I originally said, I encourage people, especially from doing the research that I've done myself, seek veterinary advice. If you're concerned about behavioural issues with your dog, whether they are a lockdown puppy or even since, it's important to try and get professional advice. And then that links nicely into what Josh has mentioned, that if you do need to see a behaviourist, make sure they are qualified and recommended, whether that's by a vet or if you've read reviews online and they've got the official accreditations and such. I know in terms of the work that we've been doing as well, reaching out to different professionals, behaviourists tend to be people who love the work that they do. The behaviourists I've spoken to are incredibly passionate about being behaviourists. I think being able to actually make these changes so that the lives of not only the family and the owners and such, but also the pet themselves, the dog, can be so much better overall. And for the behaviourist to be able to do that sort of thing, I think is amazing. So yeah, definitely try and reach out to behaviourists.
Very rewarding.
Yes, yeah, I can imagine it is. And I would also just emphasize, if anybody is wanting to train their own dog, do it in humane methods. Do it the right way. Don't be using shock collars and things like that, because again, it just makes things so much harder for vets to deal with. They end up getting the brunt of some of this further down the line, don't they? Due to these behavioural issues and such. So yeah, okay. I think that rounds off pretty nicely, Josh. Was there anything else you wanted to add regarding guidance for dog owners?
I don't think so. I mean, just sort of emphasising this is, our opinions.
Yes.
Of course, we've got our own anecdotes, and we've got our own experiences. We both have cockapoos, which are categorically a breed that is bred quite badly. I know that mine was probably bred a little bit worse than yours, but
Yes.
categorically they have behavioural issues. Anxiety is one of the biggest behavioural issues with cockapoos. Time and time again, when I speak to vets, and they ask me what dog I have, I say a cockapoo, and they go, "Oh, really?"
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
these are our own opinions, they're our own anecdotes, they're our own stories. So if
Yes.
you do have any concerns with your own dog's behaviour or a family dog behaviour, then get in touch with a professional.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. This podcast is purely to touch on a topic that, as we've mentioned, Josh and I are encountering vets bearing the brunt of with lockdown dogs, and having to deal with, and will have to deal with, those sorts of dogs for potentially another 5-10 years in some cases. And having dogs ourselves that suffer with things like social anxiety, separation anxiety, sometimes social anxiety, things like that. It's good for owners to know that they're certainly not alone when they have those sorts of issues. So, yeah, if you ever have any doubts, seek veterinary advice, and then behaviourists might be an option. So, Josh, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure getting to chat with you as always.
As always.
And as soon as we finish this recording, we'll both go and sit back next to each other at our respective desks. But still, it's all the same. It's very nice. Thank you if you have stayed with us for the entire episode. We do genuinely appreciate you listening in or watching wherever you may be. And we will be with you again soon on the next one.